Lovely. Well, we'll crack straight on. So natural capital accounting, we want to look at why do it and perhaps how do it. So I'm Peter Neal and I'll jointly present with John Sheaff. I'm going to draw on a couple of projects that we've been working jointly on in terms of preparing natural capital accounts for park strategies. This is a short overview. We have the benefit of doing a seminar after if you're interested in a bit more detail. So natural capital is increasingly being used to describe the parts of the natural environment, so that's landscape to you and me, which produce value to people. Fundamentally, natural capital is the foundation for all other types of capital. And on this, the economy, society and prosperity is built. And I know when Merrick started us this morning, no environment, no economy, no society. So it is important. But what has nature ever done for us? Asks Tony Juniper in his book, published a few years ago. And there's a great quote just towards the end of it. Although planners sometimes struggle to place values on green spaces, it is interesting to see that markets clearly do. Natural capital gives us the ability to take landscape into those markets and talk that language. Now, I slightly hesitate to stand here in front of a landscape audience talking about the value of landscape. It is innate and it's the core to our practice, and it has been the case for centuries. At Stowe, the Temple family needed no convincing of the power, value of landscape, and they chose to work with what can be referred to as the 18th century Hall of Fame, Kent, Bridgman, and then appointed Capability Brown as a head gardener in the mid-1700s. Brown then resigned, went on to set up his own practice, and the rest, as they say, is English landscape history. Jump a century, and the public parks movement cleverly flipped this valuation model on its head. So previously, we had single houses surrounded by vast landscapes. Now we have individual landscapes surrounded by vast cityscapes, particularly in our rapidly expanding towns and cities. And again, the key driver for this, as we see here with Princess Street Gardens in Edinburgh, was to establish and then increase value. And that is value for development and value for society, to improve public health, particularly in heavily polluted urban and industrial cities. We will fast forward another 150 years, so this is a quick trip through, and we've lost the understanding of this value. And it's particularly evident in the way we value and invest in our public parks and urban green spaces. So the recent State of UK Public Parks highlights the particular irony that as our cities become denser, private space becomes scarcer, open spaces are being used much more intensively, our parks are facing an unprecedented level of neglect, massive funding cuts, accompanied by hemorrhaging of staff and skills occurring at an unprecedented level. So this, for me, is where natural capital accounting offers considerable potential, because I think it provides a means to articulate value to a wider audience and hopefully, potentially, capture other sources of income. So, the routes to this for parks are interesting. Cape Space published in 2009 Making the Invisible Visible, and it's been referenced a bit through the conference already, the real value of park assets. It just highlights the challenge in public sector accounting where most local authorities value public parks at just £1. They use a mechanism of historic cost and net depreciation that sets our parks as liabilities rather than assets. It goes into starting to break down how you can value parks across the social, economic, and environmental criteria. But whilst this was not natural capital accounting, it was certainly a step towards establishing a more sophisticated way to measure and communicate value. I think probably the most interesting and significant recent studies, 2011, is for Metro Parks Tacoma, west coast, northwest United States near Seattle. And so they undertook a study on the economic impact of ecosystem services, starting to get into the detail of this. And this was across their entire park system. And 5 years on, we're starting to see this being played out here, which is fantastic. So we've just heard about the Manchester study, and more recently FTech and BDP have done a further valuation study of the green infrastructure. Mersey Forest has completed a study for Liverpool. The University of Birmingham is preparing a natural capital account for the city. And Vivid Economics has already undertaken a study for Sheffield. The balance sheet there pictured on the table looks at the natural capital account across Sheffield's parks, and they've also just recently completed a study for Greater London. So, what is the government doing about this? Along with supporting the work of Natural Capital Committee, the government is funding the development of more robust techniques for natural capital accounting. So I think our methodologies and techniques are going to tighten and become clearer. I've had a small role to play in urban natural capital accounts for the UK. So this is a piece of work, again being led by FTech, but it is looking at setting a framework which will be used by the Office of National Statistics and incorporated into UK environmental accounts in 2020. It is a means to look at the emerging discipline, but more importantly, a means to unlock the value of green infrastructure. It captures both physical flow accounts, the transfer of natural systems, and monetary flow accounts, starting to place a value on that. And so that physical flow and the monetary flow is what we wanted to explore for two park projects in London, which John will now describe in detail.
Thank you. As Peter has suggested, principal objective for us over the past 18 months has been to embed the natural capital accounting process into open spaces strategies. And I think Peter's already suggested that there's a massive body of evidence, very uniquely endowed now, with evidence to demonstrate the benefits across a whole range of economic, social and environmental indicators, the benefits of public green space. But the issue that asset managers face, and Peter's alluded to this, is that they have to sustain the quality of green infrastructure assets in their management with increasingly dwindling resources, and the capacity of those green infrastructure assets to deliver those benefits is similarly constrained. Now, two of the open spaces strategies that we've been developing recently, one in Barnet, one in Barking and Dagenham, both those boroughs will experience significant population growth over the next 25 years. Barking's population will increase by 48% by 2041. Most of that new population will be accommodated in high density housing with little access or no access to private space, placing additional pressure on green infrastructure assets. But that population growth is also a call to arms in the context of investment in green infrastructure. And one of the principal objectives and the purposes of natural capital accounting is to build a financial evidence base to support that investment. So in Barnet, we surveyed, as part of our open spaces strategy, 199 spaces across the borough, assessing the quality of those spaces. That gave us the evidence base that we needed to develop the natural capital asset register. That in turn became the catalyst for the natural capital accounting project that we subsequently developed, funded by the borough and by the Greater London Authority. Now, because the project emerged from an open spaces strategy, it was constrained by some of the definitions within that strategy. So, green space in Barnet and Dagenham, in Barnet, about 25% of the area of the borough is actually green belt. But that wasn't considered in the context of our quality assessment because it's not under the council's management. So it was excluded. When you think about the value of the ecosystem services delivered by Greenbelt, then I think it's safe to say that the values embedded in the natural capital balance sheet are probably a considerable underestimate for Barnet. The natural capital asset register is combined with 4 data sets to produce the physical flow account. and they're listed there. The value of recreational visits to Barnet's parks and open spaces, the value of physical activity expressed as avoided health costs, and the value of uplift to property values attributable to proximity to good quality green space, and lastly the value of climate mitigation regulation activity delivered by green infrastructure. Together they provide an indication of the total value of the benefits that accrue from public green space in Barnet. And by offsetting those against the cost in perpetuity of managing those assets and perpetuating those benefits, we come up with a natural capital balance sheet. That natural capital balance sheet suggests that the benefits outweigh the costs by a factor of 13 to 1, which is not an untypical finding for an exercise of this type. Moving on to Barking and Dagenham, a similar approach, but a very different portfolio of sites, far bigger, far more diverse, but in common with Barnet, a very considerable area of green belts, which we excluded from the study by virtue of it not being under the council's management. We also had a rather more limited range of data sets to build into the physical flow account in Barking and Dagenham. Principally, we excluded the consideration of the capital uplift in property value. But nevertheless, the finding is, again, that the value of the benefits accruing from public space outstrip the cost of maintaining those assets in perpetuity by a factor of 4 to 1. So in both cases, we've demonstrated that those benefits are hugely more significant than the cost of sustaining them. I think Peter has alluded to the fact that over time perhaps we have lost the connection between the value of landscape and aesthetic considerations of landscape quality. And I think that one of the powerful things about natural capital accounting is it re-establishes that connection. It allows us to quantify the return on investment in land assets. It allows us a much better understanding of how different landscape component elements work independently and in conjunction. And in Barking and Dagenham, we use the natural capital account to develop 9 master plans for the borough's most significant parks. And the master plans use the natural capital account to maximise the return on any potential investment in those green infrastructure assets. So the objective and the purpose of natural capital accounting in this context is to reinforce the power of an open faces strategy to provide our clients and local authorities and deliverers of green space services with a robust financial evidence base to support green infrastructure in the face of significant urban change and urban development, and to maximise the outcome-based richness of investment of very scarce resources. Thank you.